On March 20th, the day on which the emperor retook possession of the Tuileries Palace, which King Louis had abandoned during the night, the Grand Chamberlain, Count Verbna, called upon Madame de Montesquieu and told her that he had been the day before to Schönbrunn, charged with a disagreeable mission which he had not had the courage to fulfill, and informed her with all possible consideration that the emperor had given orders that she should be separated from his grandson, the prince, and leave for France. The well-known opinions of the worthy countess and the tender affection which she considered it her duty to foster in her pupil's heart for the emperor, his father, had rendered her an object of suspicion to the court of Vienna. In spite of her prayers, her entreaties, and her protests, she was forced to obey this cruel order. She was forced to abandon the child which she had received in her arms, which she had not left for a single moment since its birth, and which had been the object of her constant care. She refused, however, to relinquish this precious charge except on a written order from the Emperor of Austria, protesting against the violence which tore her from functions which she could only resign into the hands of him who had entrusted her with them. She demanded, in addition to a written order from the emperor, that a doctor's certificate should be given to her to prove that she had left the young prince in a perfect state of health. In reply, she received a letter from the Emperor of Austria in which she was informed that new circumstances having arisen, which rendered it necessary to make a change in the prince's household, he could not allow Madame de Montesquieu to go away without assuring her of his gratitude for the care which she had bestowed on his grandson since his birth. To this expression of esteem, which he could not refuse to conduct so noble, the Emperor Francis added the gift of a set of sapphires. The same day we learn the reason which had hastened on the young prince's departure for the imperial palace. Madame de Colloredo, who had come to lunch with the empress, told us that Count Anatole de Montesquieu had wanted to kidnap the prince, that the proof of this was contained in reports which had reached the emperor during the night, and that relays of horses had been prepared for this purpose as far as Bâle. This story about an imaginary conspiracy with the object of kidnapping the emperor's son and restoring him to his father had been accredited in memoirs published about this period, but the reports spread with reference to this matter have no real foundation. On the morrow, March 21st, the empress went and spent several hours in Vienna with her son, and then returned to Schönbrunn. In the evening, Madame de Montesquieu arrived with Count Anatole in a court carriage which had been sent her by the Grand Chamberlain. She had only left the prince after he was asleep and after having received a visit from Count Sickingen, the Emperor of Austria's chamberlain and friend. Monsieur de Sickingen's name reminds me that the Emperor Napoleon, out of respect for a request made by the Emperor Francis, had accorded a revenue of 50,000 francs to this chamberlain, the capital of which was taken from the funds of the extraordinary domain. This revenue had been given as a special favor to Count Sickingen as a compensation for the loss of estates which he possessed on the left bank of the Rhine. As Madame de Montesquieu was to return on the morrow to France with her son, the empress wrote her an affectionate letter in which she enclosed her a lock of her hair. Difficulties which they experienced in obtaining passports delayed the mother and the son in Vienna until the evening, and they were waiting with a certain impatience when Count Verbna called again and informed Madame de Montesquieu that in consequence of the events which were taking place in France, the Emperor of Austria had made up his mind to cancel the authorization which he had given her to depart, and that an apartment would be prepared for her and her son in the palace of Schönbrunn. Madame de Montesquieu refused it, saying that the persecuted would be too near the persecutor. She asked one of three things: either to be free, to return to France, to resume her service with the young prince, or to withdraw to the convent of the Visitation until the time when she would be allowed to depart. The reason why she wished to go and live in this convent was that, having been brought up in a house of this order, she'd acquired there those sentiments of religion and honor which had been the rule and the consolation of her life, sentiments which had also made her considered worthy of the charge that the Emperor Napoleon had entrusted to her. Count Verbna promised her an answer the next morning. This answer arrived at noon. The Emperor Francis gave Madame de Montesquieu leave to go and live in the convent of the Visitation. Monsieur de Verbna answered that he had just been there, only that there was no apartment vacant in this convent, and that he had chosen an apartment of 3 rooms in Vienna at the house of Monsieur Enzenberg, Archduke Louis's chamberlain, where she could live. Madame de Montesquieu accepted, resigning herself to go and live in the apartment which had been prepared for her. So painful a separation was bitterly felt by the poor little prince, who had become accustomed to the care lavished upon him by this affectionate governess. He was constantly asking for Mabecue, and the regrets which he expressed at no longer seeing her by his side were the only consolation which she could receive under these painful circumstances. In a letter which the Emperor addressed from Lyon to Marie-Louise under date of March 12th, he informed her that, summoned by the French people, he yielded to their wishes, that he was received with acclamation everywhere, that he should be in Paris in a few days, and that he expected her and his son at the end of the month. This letter had been handed to the Empress on the same day on which the young prince had been taken to Vienna. It had been sent on by the Austrian General Bubna, together with a very similar letter addressed to the Emperor. These 2 letters had been laid before the Congress. I do not know to what extent they influenced the decision which was taken in Vienna for detaining Madame de Montesquieu and her son. The latter received permission some days later to return to France, but on arriving at Lambach, the frontier of the Austrian states, he was arrested on some pretext or other, brought back to Vienna, and detained in secret confinement for 4 days. Madame de Montesquieu only regained his liberty partly thanks to Monsieur de Talleyrand's interference on his behalf and on a promise which he was forced to make that he would not leave Vienna without permission. These gratuitous severities exercised against an officer full of honor, whose social position and well-known loyalty should have protected him from such vexations, were carried out by the most servile and most brutal police in Europe. This police was, moreover, stimulated by the mistrust which was inspired by the very few French people who had remained in Vienna in the Empress's service, a mistrust which the presence of one of the Emperor's aides-de-camp, whose mother was the governess of Napoleon's son, was bound to still further increase. Countess de Montesquieu, greatly hurt by the accusations which had been made against her son, demanded in vain that the official Gazette of Vienna should publish a denial of the alleged conspiracy for kidnapping the young prince. No attention whatever was paid to this request. During Passion Week, the Empress Marie-Louise attended Mass with great assiduity, leaving Schönbrunn at 9 o'clock in the morning to be present at the religious ceremonies. On the Thursday before Easter, the Emperor and Empress of Austria washed the feet of 24 old men and women whose total ages amounted to nearly 2,000 years. Marie-Louise continued her devotional exercises in Vienna up to Easter Day. She attended Mass on that day in the chapel of the Chateau of Schönbrunn, but went to Vienna to be present at the benediction in the cathedral church. At that time, she sought relief from her sad thoughts in pious exercises and consolation which she said she could no longer find anywhere else than in religion. Reports of every kind provoked by the escape from Elba continued to circulate, supplying food to the curiosity of the idle, to the anxieties and hopes of those who were interested in the result of this extraordinary enterprise. All eyes were turned to Napoleon at this time. It was said that King Joachim had assembled his council and the principal persons in his state, that he had made a speech to them, that his son, Achille, had been carried in triumph, that the king had set out to put himself at the head of his army and to proclaim the independence of Italy in order to increase the effect of this dramatic recital, which is so favorable to the views of the Austrian government. It was falsely added that the Princess of Wales, having fallen in love with King Joachim, had refused to embark on board a frigate which had been sent to her to convey her back to England, and that she had followed the king with the army. On Easter Monday, the Empress was present at a family banquet given in Vienna on the occasion of the renewal of the Emperor's oath-taking to protect and support the Catholic religion in the presence of the Archbishop of Vienna. The Emperor and Empress of Austria proceeded with this purpose to St. Stephen's Church in great state, with a procession of carriages of Gothic shape and covered with gold, with all the court under arms, and the pages in grand livery, escorting the imperial carriage on foot. At the same time, when the young prince was removed from Madame de Montesquieu's maternal care, orders were given that members of the French imperial family should be arrested and detained in Austria. Prince Schwarzenberg sent 2 officers to the chateau at Prengat in the canton of Vaud to seize the person of King Joseph and to conduct him to Brunn in Moravia. But the prince had left Prengat when they arrived. Princess Elisa, Grand Duchess of Tuscany, had been arrested in Bologna and conducted to Brunn. She'd only been allowed 2 hours to prepare for her departure. In the presence of several officers and non-commissioned officers who crowded her apartment, she left her son at Bologna, her daughter accompanying her to Brunn. She had asked to be allowed to go and live in the country near Vienna or at Baden because the climate of Brunn was injurious to her health. This permission was not granted. The childhood of Napoleon's son needed gentler and more attentive cares than could be given him by the men to whom he had been handed over since Madame de Montesquieu's forced retirement. A certain Madame Dimitrovsky, widow of an Austrian general, was provisionally appointed to the young prince's governess and was presented in this capacity to the Empress. This lady appeared to be 30 or 32 years old. She was not pretty, but had a refined appearance and seemed amiable and anxious to please. Her daughter, who was then about 10 years old, was with her. Her remarriage with Monsieur Scrampy had been decided upon. This Monsieur Scrampy was a superior officer in the Austrian Lusignan Portuguese regiment, and he was leaving the army to enter the civil service. He was to have been attached to Baron de Vincent's legation in Ghent, but upon his marriage with Madame Dimitrovsky, the Duchess of Parma gave him a post in her household in order that he might be near his wife. This lady, after her presentation to the Empress and at the death of Madame de Brognieux, was appointed lady-in-waiting by a decision emanating from the Emperor of Austria's cabinet. She fulfilled these double duties during the first year. The Empress of Austria, who protected Madame Dimitrovsky, gave orders in person that on her return to the Chateau Schönbrunn, Madame Dimitrovsky's apartment should be got ready for her with all speed. The turn for the better in Madame de Brignol's health was not of long duration. She had grown weaker each day and was devoured by an ardent fever. I used to spend most of the day at her bedside, speaking to her, chatting to her, or reading passages which she would sometimes interrupt with judicious and remarkable reflections. Her language was full of eloquence and impressed with the loftiness of thought, which was almost sublime. In her calmer moments, she would return to her memories of the past or occupy herself with her last arrangements. One day she charged me with various private commissions, which she begged me to keep secret. She also dictated me a note containing certain arrangements referring to charities and presents which she wished to be distributed, and provided that all her papers should be sent to her businessman in Genoa. I made haste to send this note to her son directly after her death. It was not possible for me to be present with her during her last few moments, for I myself was ill and unable to leave my room. The state of excitement in which she found herself during the last days which preceded her death prevented me from speaking to her of what was going on in France. The fear-provoking an emotion which might have been injurious to her obliged us to observe prudent discretion on events so important. I heard from Madame de Montesquieu that she had told her all these things on the day before her death. Countess de Brignol at least carried into her grave with her the hope which it needed but 2 months to destroy for those who survived. After she had breathed her last, Count Delberg, her son-in-law, hastened to come and see me, being very anxious to know whether his mother-in-law had made any arrangements in his favor with which I might be charged to acquaint him. I bitterly regretted the premature death of this lady, who was as distinguished by her mental gifts as by her qualities of heart. She was not yet 50 years old. She died during the night in her doctor's arms, assisted only in this supreme moment by 2 faithful servants. She was deprived of the comfort of taking farewell of her son, who was the Genoese minister at the Congress. The state in which he had left his mother on the previous evening had not made him think that the end was so near. When he arrived, it was to find that she was dead. Whilst he was accomplishing this painful journey, his daughter, a child of 5 years who had been suffering from croup for several days past, also breathed her last. Thus, in a few moments, he lost the dearest objects of his affection. Death seemed to have awaited his absence to remove them both. Few misfortunes could be compared to the misfortune which thus fell upon the unhappy Marquis de Brignoles. On the second day following Madame de Brignoles's death, after the doctors had carried out the post-mortem examination, her body was buried in the cemetery at Hitzing, which is a village near Schönbrunn, where some Frenchmen who died in exile, amongst others Clary, Louis XVI's old valet de chambre, were buried. Marie-Louise was present at the funeral service in the church in the company of Madame Dimitrovsky, who had just been appointed her lady-in-waiting. The Treaty of March 25th had been signed. The operations of the Congress had been followed by military movements. The Emperor Alexander seemed to have assumed the role of quartermaster to the Austrian troops. Every day, dressed in Austrian uniform, he used to go either to the Burg Square or to the Prater to review the regiments on their way through the city of Vienna. He used to take the Prince Imperial of Austria with him. The good citizens of Vienna had a charge in their sightseeing. Instead of tournaments, carriage and sled races, there were military parades, the rolling of drums, the rumbling of cannon and artillery caissons. The majority of the princes of the secondary states had left Paris. The Emperor of Austria, dragged in the train of the Emperor of Russia, was to follow the latter to Prague to review the Russian troops there. Prince Schwarzenberg was leaving to take over the command-in-chief of the Austrian troops. Archduke Charles had accepted the government of Mayence. The Emperor of Russia was in a state of violent excitement. Prince Eugene, whose intimacy he had sought after, had become an object of suspicion in his eyes. A groom attached to the latter's service, returning from France, where he had been to visit the family and who had left Paris on March 22nd, had brought back letters from Queen Hortense, Count Lavalette, and Monsieur Soulange Baudin, the prince's intendant, which spoke of the enthusiasm with which the emperor's return had been met, of the hopes which had been conceived as to the speedy return of the empress and her son, and of Queen Hortense's intention of going to receive them at Strasbourg. Certain expressions which had offended the Emperor Alexander had crept into the queen's letter. This courier was arrested at Stuttgart and sent to Vienna, and the letters which he carried were read out to the Congress. It was concluded from this that Prince Eugene was an accomplice in Napoleon's return to France. General Chernichev came to inform the prince in his master's name that the Emperor Alexander was obliged to break off all communication with him, and in spite of all his efforts, Prince Eugene was unable to entirely justify himself, to clear himself of all suspicion of being in connivance with the Emperor Napoleon. He was obliged to promise not to leave Germany. If it was important to the Allies that Prince Eugene should not return to France, where his help might have been useful to the emperor, Austria feared his presence in Italy still more. No sooner had she re-entered into possession of the provinces of which the hazard of war had stripped her, than she neglected nothing to assure herself of their quiet possession, to extend her influence. Her first care had been to remove the generals and principal officers of the Italian army, sending them to serve in Hungary and replacing them by Austrian officers. I was constantly seeing at Prince Eugene's house Italian generals passing through Vienna on their way to their new destination. The measure taken with them seemed to affect them very disagreeably. They were deprived of the order of the Crown of Iron, for which another order bearing the Emperor Francis's effigy, accompanied by emblems recording the events by which Italy had again been placed under the rule of Austria, was substituted. Archduke John was sent to these provinces. with the title of Viceroy, provided with extraordinary powers for assuring the emperor's authority in this country. Count Aldini, tired of his useless sojourn in Vienna, had asked to be allowed to return home, but this had been refused.